welcome to the podcast. This is Bristol Real. I'm Val.
I'm Jerome.
And I'm Tom. Today we have Dr. James Norman on the podcast. He's a lecturer in civil engineering at the University of Bristol who recently gave a Best of Bristol lecture, which is how we found out about him.
Yeah, as you said, Tom, we've all heard him talk and we know how inspirational he is. Obviously, there's the Best of Bristol lecture, which he briefly talked about. We also talked about his approach to education, his thoughts on sustainable engineering solutions, and his own record label, Brian Records, which we'll be posting a link to in the description. And then on top of that, his son he's written a comic book, which is absolutely incredible. And even better, that's to fundraise for rainforest conservation.
Hope you enjoy it. So today we're joined by Dr. James Norman. He's a lecturer at the University of Bristol for the civil engineering course. Thanks for taking the time out of your day.
No, it's a real pleasure.
We actually found out about you during your Best of Bristol lecture.
Yeah.
We attended that and we thought it was fantastic, so
Thank you.
followed up on that.
Yeah, I'd seen you lecture at Bath once before.
Okay, you came over and you heard it again.
I came all the way for that. Absolutely fantastic, so no, very good lecture.
I thought we might as well say, if people haven't actually listened to your lecture, maybe summarise it in a couple of minutes, basically the key points of it. It might be difficult.
Okay. My key points were, one, we need to start doing stuff now. So I use a children's book called Not Now Bernard, which is about how his parents just are so busy with their own lives that they failed to witness Bernard's very painful demise and replacement by a large child-eating monster. And the point was we're just so busy, all of us kind of living our own lives and with our own problems, that we fail to appreciate the bigger problems in the world, and actually we need to stop kind of focusing on our own little problems and start engaging in the massive problems. So that was the first thing. Second thing was we're not going to make the changes that we need to make by making tiny little incremental changes in our life. We need to make big changes. So I talked about the idea of a paradigm shift, which is where you completely change the way you do things. And I used a children's book called Stuck, which is an absurd tale of a child trying to get a kite out of a tree, and he just keeps throwing more and more absurd things into the tree to knock the kite out. And it's funny because the child is being so stupid, and yet we're doing exactly the same thing in sustainability, you know, and we laugh at other people when they do it, and yet we don't spot it when we're doing it ourselves. And so, yeah, massive change, and just the need to be creative. Actually, I think engineers are awesome at solving problems, and I think probably we have a lot of solutions to the problems of sustainability already, but what we don't have is any of those solutions being put into practice. So there are a few things I was trying to do kind of explicitly in my words, but also implicitly through the way I was giving my presentation. So I was using stories, children's stories, to tell the story, because actually it sticks with people and they laugh. Laughter is really important because it means that people emotionally connect with you, and when they emotionally connect with you, they're more likely to trust you. I didn't use any numbers. I've been reading this book called Made to Stick, and apparently if you want someone to make a heart change kind of decision, so they're choosing to change their lifestyle, or they're choosing to give money, or they're choosing to do something that is perceived good but is not necessarily good just for them, it's kind of good on a bigger scale, you're not going to achieve, when you make them think analytically, they're less likely to make that decision. And as soon as you start saying numbers, you know, there's this problem and these are the numbers, you know, we're producing this many billions of tons of this, or what people start thinking analytically, and it makes them less likely. So there's this really difficult quandary for us as engineers, because we love numbers and we kind of live by numbers, and that's our world and the language that we use. But actually, when we're communicating to the wider world, how do we communicate to them in a way where they stop, you know, we kind of enable them to engage in a hard decision to change the way they live their life. So it's kind of this crazy trying to use creativity and trying to communicate our important message, and a message which is backed up by numbers, but actually not necessarily being explicit in the numbers, but, you know, trying to encourage people to trust us and go with us on something rather than, you know, hitting them over the head with numbers and saying you must do this. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's particularly frustrating as an engineer when people think that you're quite dull and analytical and not creative people, because I personally consider myself to be. But I don't like. I think it's because you think engineers, you think engines, and you think spanners, and you think grease. But it's not that. It's about the most creative profession you can be in, I think. Yeah,
it's an amazingly creative profession to be in, and you know the problems we solve are all really creative. I love it. I've been learning the difference, you know, between I'm not a very good drawer in terms of no one would pay money for my drawings. They're not beautiful works of art, but I am really good at drawing in terms of I can draw my way around a problem, and by the time I've finished drawing on a piece of paper, I'll know what the solution is. And that's a really creative process, but people see creativity as the end product, whereas for me it's all about that creative process solves that problem, and therefore it releases something. And children, when they draw, they tell a story. They're not worried about what the final picture looks like. They're worried about the story and what happens in that process. And as engineers, often that's how we work as well. But that isn't necessarily something that's valued by people. Does that make sense? So it's kind of sharing that and shouting about that and getting excited about that.
Also, in your lecture, you mentioned, I think, which made everybody laugh, is how you have a deep love for concrete. Yeah. Why is that?
I think it's, in all honesty, it's a material I've used a lot in my life as a professional engineer, and you can do anything with it. And actually, it's easy to dismiss it because it is a material which is not handled particularly well by a lot of architects and by a lot of engineers. But it is a phenomenal material. You're basically kind of creating liquid stone. You pour it into a mould. When you take off the mould, you've got a new piece of stone, and you can pretty much build whatever you want out of it. From the Sydney Opera House to kind of a tiny little. There's this beautiful chapel in France, and I can't name defeats me, but it's this kind of modern brutalist gem, and it's just beautifully detailed. And I just think the more I've played with concrete and the more I've done with it, the more I've appreciated how much can be done with it. And actually, kind of in the 60s, they had this sudden eureka moment where they realised that, and the world became their oyster. And actually, we've kind of dumbed concrete back down a bit and kind of reverted to, right, we know how to do it this way, so that's just what we'll do. But actually, it's an incredibly versatile material. And I love, modernism is a love or hate thing, definitely. But I just think that bold sense of adventure that kind of the early modernists had is just really exciting. And I just think as a material, it's really interesting. To me, it offers so much more than kind of certainly steel or other materials. And that's totally a personal thing. I can see for 99.9999% of the population, they don't get excited about concrete. And I've been teaching it now for a long time, and actually I get really excited about it because I think it's just such a powerful, such an incredibly versatile material.
At the same time, you said that there's a need to move away from concrete.
Yeah.
How do you think that's completely necessary to get rid of concrete completely?
No, I think that an engineer is actually like an artist, and I've got this analogy where basically most practicing engineers at the moment, they have two colours on their palette. They have the colour of steel and colour of concrete, and that's it. And what I'd love to see is engineers who are equipped with kind of, they can design out of steel, they can design out of concrete, but they can also use timber, they can also use glass and rammed earth and straw bale and FRP. And there are all these materials that we haven't even thought of yet, because I'm hoping for some serious acceleration of innovation in our industry. And actually that explosion of and therefore you've got the ability to say what is the most suitable solution here. Whereas I feel like at the moment our thing is, can I make it out of steel or concrete? Which one is it? And there's no alternative. And there are so many buildings and designs which actually could be made out of timber. Timber is a fantastically versatile material. We should be using it massively more than we are. But there's just this default, right, I know how to do a concrete building. I did one last month. I'll do another one this month. And it's trying to shake people out of that. Come on, actually concrete is amazing, but it comes as a big environmental cost. So when we use it, we've got to be intelligent about using it, and we've got to have a really good reason for using it rather than just assuming it's going to be concrete because there's no other choice.
When would you specifically want to use concrete rather than timber or other materials you mentioned?
So big spans. And that again is another conversation, isn't it? Because actually, why do we have to have such big spans? There's kind of this move towards open plan spaces, which architects love, but is it always essential? And I think what's interesting is we're going bigger and bigger and bigger. Certainly things like universities, kind of lecture spaces are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I was working on a new building for Bath University just before I came here, and it was all about getting big lecture spaces. And you just think, really, in 10 years' time, are we going to have big lecture spaces? Or is the style of teaching and everything, with the rate at which technology is moving, is it going to have changed again, and are we going to suddenly have all these massive spaces and not need them? I don't know for sure at all, but it's just a really interesting conversation, and it's funny, isn't it? Because like Tesco has built these mega stores, and suddenly they realise that that's not how people shop anymore, and they've got all these massive shops that they want to mothball, and it's kind of, is it always necessary? I just want to challenge people to think outside the box a bit, really, and say, is it necessary? Do we have to have this big space? Could we have made the building a bit smaller, done it out of timber? Those kind of questions.
Mm-hmm. Could you provide some background on the sort of projects you've worked on where you've used alternative materials besides steel and concrete?
Yeah, so I've done a few. I've done probably one of my favourite projects of all time. And I think I mentioned it at the beginning of my Bob lecture. I designed the new sixth form building at my old secondary school, which is in Bath, which is really exciting. It's really exciting because I still live in Bath, so my kids are going to go to that school. So that's really exciting. And we went that the architect was really positive about not using steel and concrete, but using other materials. And we had great conversation, and we kind of played around with lots of materials. We ended up using cross-laminated timber, which is a very engineered form of timber, which is great stuff, and I've used it on probably 4 or 5 projects. And then with some internal rammed earth, and the rammed earth for me was it looks beautiful, but it was going to be a much bigger part of the building, and then just due to logistics and kind of the moving around of the project and stuff, it ended up being quite a small part of the project, but it still looks really beautiful. And it's just a really lovely building. It's won a few prizes now, and it's really nice to know that you're involved in a project like that, which is also part of your own life. It kind of is really exciting, and it's had massively positive response from local people. And so as soon as you stop building with concrete, people get excited about it. It's funny, we've pulled back, you can see all the structure. If you did that with concrete, people tend to get pretty upset about it, but when you do it with timber, they're like, oh, this is beautiful, I really love this space. So that's a really nice example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you said there's many other materials you could use to maybe kind of the post-concrete era might comprise of. You talked about rammed earth. You also mentioned that in your lecture. Could you maybe talk about why that's so great? Because I think you said that you didn't have time in the lecture. You probably don't have time either. But
I was talking about straw bale when I said it was awesome stuff, and I don't have time. I can say about both. I taught rammed earth last week. It's amazing. I love rammed earth. For me, earth is amazing because it's massively abundant. It is stunningly beautiful. I think when you go into a rammed earth building, there is just something really fantastically beautiful about it. It's hard to describe in words, but it's just things like the way that when the light falls on the surface, it changes, and the subtlety of colour is incredible. Architects kind of really like it, and I really like it. It also does something called thermal buffering. Now, for me as a slightly overweight person, I don't particularly like highly humid spaces, and therefore when you get like a space where actually the humidity is dealt with by the building material, that's really exciting for me because I really hate humidity. So it has lots of positive natural kind of attributes, but it also, it's not very expensive. Well, you can debate about the price. It's not very CO2 intensive. You can, when you finish building with rammed earth, as long as you don't put cement into it, which I'm very keen not to, and I'm doing a bit of research at the moment on making sure that doesn't happen, you can basically just take the earth apart again and dig it into the ground. It kind of is just, to me, it embodies what sustainability is all about. Straw is quite different. Straw is a much lighter material. It's massively abundant. We kind of plough straw back into the ground. We have to be really, really careful. There is this massive misconception that straw and hay are the same things, whereas straw and hay are not the same thing at all. So straw construction, people talk about hay. Hay is for horses. It's a feed. Straw is for houses. We can make buildings out of it. It doesn't have any grain in it. It's so it is a completely different material. So people say, oh, well, won't you get infested by rats? Well, they don't, if it's a straw bale, then there's nothing for the rats to eat. The bale is compressed, so it's at a very high density, so it's actually very difficult to burrow into. So there are all these kind of misconceptions about straw which are not true. But what it does do is it not only is it very sustainable in terms of It's a massively abundant material. It's renewable, but also it has an incredibly high insulation value. So, in fact, I know a lot of the guys who work for mobcell, and they've just been received Passive House standard for their mobcell product, which means it's got phenomenal insulation. It's got very good airtightness, which is really important in terms of the building performance and making sure the building is energy efficient and minimising energy use. So it's an amazing material for lots of reasons, but that's some of them.
Yeah, you talked about mobcell actually. I've got the
Yeah.
is it Lilac? The Lilac project in
yes.
Leeds. That looks really exciting. What is the kind of basic premise of that? It seems to be more than just sustainable materials wise. It seems
sure.
to have a huge kind of everything about it is kind of perfectly within that kind of.
Yeah, it's amazing. I haven't read the details recently, so I might get some of this wrong, but just the whole way the project is funded, and it's kind of really different to your normal way a project is funded. It's not about making as much money as possible. It's about providing sustainable housing, and things like the cost of the properties, as far as I can remember, is the idea is it's tied in with inflation of wages. So the idea is that the housing never becomes unaffordable for the average person, and it was all the building materials was part of their sustainability agenda, but their sustainability agenda was much bigger than that, which is what I thought was really exciting and actually really beautiful. There's a lot of things which are really kind of incredible in terms of the way they approach life in that project, which I think we should all kind of be taking stock of and looking at and thinking, okay, there are other ways of doing a housing estate. There are other ways of building co-housing, and they really lead the way on that, I think.
Do you mind if I go ahead? Yeah. I was wondering about your creative process, because you're clearly a very creative person. Do you have any advice or tips for our listeners as to what sort of process they should follow, or you know what I mean?
Yeah. I walk and run a lot, and I do all my thinking then. For me, I've always been reasonably creative, but I think when I started running a record label, I suddenly got this there was no change in me in terms of my ability, but in terms of my confidence. I basically realised that I could do things, not that what I do is special, because I don't really think what I do is special, but I just had this confidence that if I do stuff, people would be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So that for me was a bit of a, wow, okay, so I could start a lecture by reading a book and people would think me mad, but actually that would be okay. It kind of gave me that confidence, whereas before I'd done a record label, I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that. And for me, a lot of creativity is not, I think especially for people like engineers who are kind of pigeonholed into being told they're not creative, even if they know they are, they lose the confidence to express that creativity because they're kind of pigeonholed into you're not creative. And for me, it was much more about realising that actually I could just get up there and do stuff and that would be okay, and it didn't matter if it didn't really work. And I suddenly found this confidence to just do it and not worry about whether people kind of said, oh, yes, that's very good or not, but actually it was about more just having fun and making people think and having a bit of a laugh.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your record label. What made you start that? Do you play instruments or?
No, I don't play instruments. I've been in a music club for 10 years, which was just an excuse for 7 blokes to meet up for a beer once a month, and we talk about music. And it's just like a book club, but we produce, one of us, we take it in turns to produce a CD, which typically has kind of 3 songs by 4 different artists on, and then we come together and we chat about it. We say if we like it or not, and basically off the back of that, on our 50th meeting, because being men, we kind of numbered our meetings and made these booklets, and it all became, it's bizarre. It's kind of quite, I don't want to say religious because it's not at all like anything to do with faith, but in terms of it's quite a liturgical experience, and that we do it in the same way every time, and even to the point where the way round the circle we go is always the same, and people get a bit upset if we go the wrong way around the circle. So we kind of got really locked into this groove of how we do it. And for our 50th meeting, I thought, do you know what? Rather than putting music out there that's already out there, I'd write to people and say, this is our 50th meeting, it feels like a big deal. Would you write us a new song that we could have for our club rather than kind of listening to stuff that's already out there? And I managed to collect enough stuff to do that. And then one of the guys who didn't want to release any music with me just said, this sounds really interesting, and you thought of selling some? And it was going to cost me, I wanted to make a record because I'm a complete record buff. I collect records. I've actually got a record player in my office for listening to new purchases. And so it had to be a record, and I realised that was going to cost me a fair amount of money, about £200-300. And I realised that if I made a few more, I could sell them and kind of cover the costs and make it cost neutral. So I did one, and I just loved it, and I just got totally the bug, and I've just been doing it ever since. And it's been really exciting. I just really enjoy doing it. And I think it has, although maybe not directly in engineering sense, it has given me that confidence to do other stuff, which is really cool. I'm really excited about that.
What's the name of the record label?
It's called Brian Records.
Okay.
So our music club, 7 blokes, we call it Brian. We don't actually know why, but it's just, we were looking for a name and Brian fit the bill, so that was that. We were kind of off. So Brian Records sprang out Brian the Music Club.
How do you actually find people for this? I know it's steering away from engineering.
Yeah, that's fine.
How do you find people for your record label to actually release your music?
So I just normally just email people. So I emailed 2 guys who'd been on the music club before, and the guys had all really liked. So I just emailed them and said, look, I'm doing this thing. I wanted it to be a bit special. Would you be interested in making an original bit of music for me? And they said yes. So that kind of started it. And then once you've got one person, it's really easy to get more people, because you can say, I've got this person that you already know and often have collaborated with on previous projects. They're working with the label. Would you like to do something too? And so once I had one, I've kind of released, I'm on my 22nd release now. So I've done some stuff with, it's hard to say big names, but one guy, Niels Fromm, did a release for me really early on, and he's playing in the Colston Hall in a few months' time, and we'll probably sell it out. So he's got to that kind of size, which is really exciting, because we only released 75 of those, I think. So at the time, there were only that many people in the world who wanted it, and he's now at that point where he's selling out 2,000 seats in Bristol alone, or whatever it is.
How many records do you sell on average each time you produce one at the moment? So
it's a micro label. So I aim for between 20 and 200, depending on how much work goes into it and what it is. I think probably on average it's about 75. It's probably a fair number of each release. And that's kind of part of what I want it to be about. I never want it to be like this massive thing. It's exciting that it's easy to do. I can get it out there quick. People review it, they like it, so it gets a bit of media on kind of online record shops and stuff like that. But it's never this snowballed into something bigger than it needs to be. It's kind of just a hobby still.
Are they all local Bristol and Bath?
No, not at all.
Around the whole country?
All around the world.
Oh, around the world, okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's the power of the internet, right? You can just email someone, and it's really exciting when you kind of email someone who's based in, I don't know, Germany or America or something like that, and then they come over for a gig like 3 years later, and you're like, we can finally meet in person at last. It's always really good. So, yeah.
That's really cool. I keep asking questions about this, but in terms of vinyl, do you think that vinyl is it's having a bit of resurgence? Everyone always says it is, but do you see that from inside the industry?
I don't know. I'm far too small to know. I mean, the guys who buy from me are probably my age and just love I've always loved small run music. I've always loved vinyls. I've always loved the packaging. To me, that's a massive part. And actually, that's where my engineering comes in. I try and, do a bit of paper engineering and make it all a bit interesting and a bit different. I don't know. I was debating this with a colleague, whether the resurgence in vinyl is people about my age rebuying stuff and kind of they've reached a point where they've got a big enough income that they can start buying more and more on vinyl again, or whether it's your generation of guys kind of getting excited about vinyl and buying it. To my mind, you guys probably don't know what a record is, but that might be unfair. But but I think it's an interesting one. I don't know where and probably it's a bit of everything. I would have thought.
Yeah,
I know several people who like to collect vinyl about our age. So
okay.
I think it's still there. What do you think it is about vinyl that's so special? Why do you choose to have these far bigger discs than, say, I don't know, abstract, sort of just like a digital file, for example?
It's because they're magic. Yeah. they really are. I mean, honestly, I did a PhD in structural dynamics, so I understand signal processing, and to me, a digital disc, is kind of read and is turned into audio. It's just that makes sense. But a piece of metal which is dragged through a bumpy groove And that it gets amplified, often without the need for any sort of digital intervention into music. It's just, honestly, I can't understand how that works. It just seems incredible. It's really exciting, but it's just kind of, I'm sure it's very simple, but to me it just seems really, really amazing. So there's that. I do love the packaging, and I love the sound. I love the softness of the sound. It's probably just me being an old man as well. It's kind of that nostalgia thing. But for me, it's just a really awesome format. I like tapes as well a little bit, so I do some tape releases too.
Do you do the cover art for them? You mentioned that you did interesting things with the paper. What sort of things are they?
Yeah, so most of my work I try and make it out of reasonably easily obtainable materials. So I often fold bits of A3 or A4 paper up to make the sleeves, and then I do most of the cover artwork designs myself. So the last project was by a guy called Immigrant, who is a Scotsman who is now living in Thailand. So he is an immigrant, and that's his name. His name just triggered in me. I don't know if you guys have come across a magazine called Colours magazine, which I think was originally set up by the United Colours of Benetton, but it's become its own separate entity. But they are the most beautiful magazines, if you like magazines, just incredible paper engineering. But there was one on immigration, which just... I just read it and it shocked me really quite deeply, to the point where I kind of needed like half a day of just like trying to rearrange my head and kind of get back to like a place where I could feel like actually the world is okay. It's not obviously as good now as it was before I read that, but it's okay, because these stories of people just normal people, like us, trying to just make normal lives, and the horrific circumstance they're in and the massive risks they would take to try and move somewhere where they could start a life which we would just take for granted. And I was like, whoa, I can't believe that this, it goes on, but you don't really know it goes on until you read about it. And for me, this magazine just did that. So I kind of put the two together, and I used the images in the magazine to create the artwork for the release, because to me it just all seemed tied together and important. But I don't know if the people who buy it will feel that connection, but it seemed a good thing.
Yeah, you also talked about your son started a comic book.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit about that? How it got started?
Yeah, we can talk about that. It's great. I love that. That's one of my favourite things that's happening at the moment. So he's 10 years old, and he hates the fact that we're cutting down the rainforest, which is totally a good thing to hate, what we're doing. And he used to whinge at me literally every day as we were walking to school. He would just tell me how awful it was that this thing was happening. And it got to the point where I was like, look, listen, buddy, I'm not... He kind of didn't really get the difference between kind of deforestation and using trees for buildings, which is actually quite a good thing to do as long as it's done in a renewable way. So we started trying to have a conversation with that, but that didn't really work out. But the other thing was, I was like, you're whinging, but you're not doing anything. Like, it's not okay to see a problem and just say, there's this problem here. I kind of felt at the age of 10, if I can teach him that if he sees a problem, it's not okay just to say there's a problem, but actually he needs to do something about it. That seems to me that a lesson that he could hopefully take into the rest of his life. So we kind of said, well, look, let's do something. What could we do? You're 10 years old. You're not going to go and solve the problems of deforestation, but you could probably do something. So we talked about buying an acre. And from there, he decided he wanted to do a comic. And we're just really lucky because his friend's dad is a graphic designer, so he pulled the comic together, so it looks beautiful. We have some friends who do comics, so we kind of wrote to them and asked them to get involved. So we kind of had some connections, which was really exciting, but also it was just really nice. He was able to, read the comics by people and say, because I like comics too. So he would read them and say, I'd like this person to be involved. Or there was people he already knew of who he was really excited to get involved. So between us, we kind of scratched our heads, and between his friend and his friend's dad, we kind of all put our brain power together, and he pulled this thing together. And curated it. They decided what they wanted to go in, where they wanted it to go, all of that sort of stuff. Did their own comics, which was hilarious, actually, because at age 10, he draws comics all the time. And then suddenly he had to draw a comic for his comic. And it became like homework because he had to do it. And as soon as he had to do it, he had this massive mental block on, I can't do it. Which was really interesting to see, because I just assumed he'd churn out 400 pages and we'd be really struggling to decide what to leave out. But suddenly, because he had to do it, he really struggled to do it, which was good. I think it was a good learning experience for him to realise when you have to do something, it still can be fun and it's still good to do. So yeah, that was really interesting. But he did it, and we wanted to raise £100. He's raised £600 so far, which is really exciting. As I said, that for him is the equivalent of 12 years' salary, because he gets £1 pocket money a week. If I could raise that much money for the rainforest, that would be awesome. So yeah, it was just about kind of engaging him in that, and I'm hoping that will carry on. That this is the beginning for something for him rather than the end of the conversation, because he still cares about that stuff. He still wants to do more stuff. So. And
you can get a comic online, or
he's got a Tumblr site called BarkCC, which so CC is the Conservation Conversation, which is totally their decision. We were like, really, that's going to work, but apparently it's good. So it's BarkCC. bark-cc.tumblr.com.
I'm sure we'll put a link.
Yeah. And then, so we sell it through online. We don't sell it directly online ourselves, but we sell it through an online shop called Page 45, who's just an awesome comic shop in Nottingham, and they agreed to stock it. So, and then we're going to hopefully do the Bristol Zine Fair next year as well. So he did it last year, which was amazing. These 2 10-year-olds selling comics to all these adults. It was really exciting to see. I kind of figured that probably after the first hour they'd get bored and we'd have to man it. But they were just like, no, go away. So I had an entire day kind of walking around the Zine Fair, kind of trying to just keep a distance on it, safe eye on him from a distance. But I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near him because he was like in control of it, which was awesome, really exciting.
You've talked a couple of times today about how creativity and fun are kind of synonymous and linked together. Is that something that you try and instill in your students when you're teaching? Do you have a teaching style that encourages that?
No, absolutely not. No, my teaching style is very rigid, and there will be no fun in my lectures whatsoever. Laughter is completely banned. No, I've not ever thought about it, but I think having a laugh is really important, right? And actually having a laugh, like, I think my students reasonably enjoy their concrete lectures on a Friday morning, and the only possible reason is because at some point we start laughing about the subject and we kind of bring in some humanity, because, there's nothing exciting about learning about concrete at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. There's no earthly reason why people would get excited about that. But because we start making it fun, suddenly you get a level of engagement, and I hope my students do enjoy it because of that. And so, trying to make the students laugh is something not in a pranky, silly way, but just trying to be real with them, really. So I tell them the real life stories of all the stuff that I've done, because I've been a practicing engineer for 14 years, and that's part of what I do as well. So I think fun has to be part of the process, but it's a serious subject as well, so I try and shock them a bit. At the end of the day, if a building falls down, people die, and I think when they start my course they kind of don't really realise that, and definitely by the end of it they're well aware of the importance of doing what we do well. So it is fun, but it's also it is a really important thing that we take it seriously. So it's kind of saying that actually both those things are okay and they can both happen at the same time as well. So hopefully, but I've never thought about it in the way you've just put it, so maybe it just comes out.
Yeah. As a practicing civil engineer, you're talking about creativity. Is it frustrating sometimes working with an architect when they're the creative one and you're the boring mathsy one? Because I don't know. I personally might not enjoy that.
There were quotes, unquotes there.
There were definitely. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's really variable. So I definitely worked with architects who really want you to stay in your box, and they basically have all the ideas and you have to just do what they say. And that is really hard work, and that definitely takes all the fun out of it. But the best projects are always the ones where it's a collaboration. And there's a real crisis in engineering at the moment because we don't get enough people into engineering. And in the really exciting New Civil Engineer, which I read to my children as punishment when they're bad because it's so boring, in that really exciting magazine, they say we need people to, kind of start. There are these star architects called Starchitects like Zaha Hadid, Norman Foster. We need the same in civil engineering. And actually, to me, being an engineer is not about your individual personality. It's about working as a team, and that is really fundamental. So every project I've ever worked on, I've not been the only engineer on that project. I've always worked with other people. Sometimes it's been my boss, sometimes it's been people below me, but it's always been a collaborative thing. And likewise, with good architects, it's always a collaborative thing. And that's what I love about engineering is actually it is a collaboration, and it is about working in a team, and it is about sharing ideas. And it becomes creative because you hit all these problems. And even if you're not the architect, you say to the architect, well, have you thought about it this way? Have you thought about it that way? You know, this detail could be done that way, and you'd still achieve what you want to do, but it would also achieve what I want to do. And those kind of conversations are awesome. And suddenly you're no longer in your little uncreative number crunchy box. You're in your can be creative. You still have to do the numbers for sure, but you can be a lot more than that. But yeah, so I think it's about getting everyone, inspired about being a team and collaborating. And also honouring architects, because actually they really are creative people, but they have to hold a huge amount that engineers don't have to worry about. And some of it's creative, a lot of it is really boring, like how far anyone is from a fire exit and all of this sort of stuff. They worry about that stuff too. So it's an interesting one, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
Just going back to right at the beginning, what
Yeah.
exactly made you want to become a civil engineer?
Okay.
Was there something particularly, someone inspired you or something?
Yeah, I don't know if it was a person. As a young person, say 16-year-old, I started doing things like the Model United Nations, and I got really interested in kind of international development. And so someone said to me, actually, if you want to do something to change the world, don't be a doctor, be an engineer and provide people with clean water. Like, more lives can be saved by providing clean water than anything else. And so I went to university knowing that I was going to do international development and that I was going to provide clean water around the world. That was like my ambition and my heart. And then I realised that I didn't really enjoy that side of things, and that wasn't what I was good at. I was good at the structure stuff, so building design. So somehow I kind of managed to come out the other end not doing what I was expecting to do. But I don't think I've ever not kind of been passionate about changing the world. It's just my skill set didn't necessarily match the skill set required for kind of international development in terms of water. So I've kind of ever since been learning skills, and every project I work on, I learn more and more. And I've kind of got to the point, not where I've learned everything. I've now got loads and loads still to learn, but I reached a point kind of recently where I thought, actually, I've learned enough that I can go back into uni and start teaching people kind of full time, but not just how to do stuff, but also how to think about how we might do stuff differently and get really excited. So that, for me, that whole sustainable construction thing is massively important. And actually, it's not about do we build out of concrete or rammed earth. It's about what else is out there too. How can we skill ourselves so that in 3 years' time, if someone discovers a new type of building material, we can quickly learn how to use it and implement it, and having those skills. So I guess that's my journey, and I don't think I've finished my journey. I'm still passionate about, doing stuff to get involved in international development. I've not kind of given up on that. I just think maybe that's going to happen in 10 years' time when my kids are old enough to go to university and I can start travelling the world and doing stuff. So, I'm kind of still in the middle of that journey for me, but it's about wanting to do something to make the world a better place. That's always been like my driving impetus, really. Which I think is probably true for a lot of engineers, really.
Yeah, I think that's, for interviews, that's one of the most said quotes. Impact.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
people mean it too.
Yeah. I think that's one of the main reasons people go into it.
And I think the interesting thing is, how do you maintain that impact when you start working in an industry which isn't always as excited about changing the world as you are? And I think that's I had some interesting conversations with final year students who were like, well, I want to learn how to do this, and this company would be really good at teaching me, but actually I'm not convinced they're as excited about sustainability as I am. Should I work for them, or should I go and do something else? And it's that kind of, how do you keep that, go and work for them, go and learn all the skills, but also keep that fire alive of, actually, it's about more than this, and I really want to do something to change the world and do it in a really positive way. But I've got to learn a load of skills. I can't just do it as soon as I graduate. So you've got to learn the skills, but you still got to have that question that says, actually, at the end of every year or 3 years, I'm going to say, okay, have I learned enough now that I can go and do this in a way which will really make the impact I want to? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favourite building?
Do I have a favourite building?
Just about to ask that one.
Yeah, my house. No, I don't know. do you know, It's really rubbish because I tell my students they have to have a favourite building, and if they get asked in an interview what their favourite building is, then they have to be able to say. But for me, I mean, I don't know many buildings, so I can tell you the favourite building that I've worked on, but what I think is really difficult, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about how tied we are to the visual image of a building. And yet the quality of a building is not experienced through a photo, it's experienced through living in it. So actually, when I say my house, I am joking, because my house is like a 1970s council house on a council estate in a little rough bit of Bath. But I also mean it because that's the building that I've got most affinity with and I've actually lived in for the most amount of time. And I think it's easy to look at a photo and say, yeah, that is a good building and that's a bad building. But until you live in it and kind of work in it and actually see if it works in that way, it's completely impossible to say. So my experience of buildings is quite limited because I've not worked in or lived in that many. My favourite project, the Tate is a phenomenal building, and I love Herzog and de Moor, and I think are incredible, not because they changed masses, but because they respected what was already there and they saw the potential of it. So that turbine hall is a phenomenal space, and actually it's a bonkers thing to not fill it with gallery space because it makes no financial sense, but yet they created kind of a landmark building which no one would have expected by not doing anything in that space. And that decision not to kind of intervene is as important as the decision to intervene. And the way they've done that on the new extension as well, because I worked on that for a while, and just seeing their process and seeing them say, wow, this industrial mess is actually really beautiful. We're just going to keep it like this. We don't want to beautify it and make it feel more normal. We love it as it is. We love the fact it's industrial and messy. And so for me, that was really exciting. And I think that what they achieved kind of was really countercultural in a lot of ways, because everyone just, has to make everything look good. And yet they've just left it as it is. And it's in a phenomenal space. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
About sustainability, it seems that your expertise particularly is materials and knowledge of particular materials, but there's many other routes to sustainability. Do you have an opinion on solar panels on buildings? Do you think every building should have solar panels, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't know the statistics. I know that I've read a few little bits and pieces by other people. I think the main thing from what I've read, and I'm not at all an expert on this, is it doesn't matter whether it's wind turbines, solar panels, ground source heat pumps. The main thing is you actually need to engage in these decisions as a community. So if you start providing district heating for your whole estate, that is much more, sustainable than one person just putting some solar panels on their roof. Likewise, if you're going to provide wind farms, kind of doing it on a big scale for a whole community is much better than one person trying to put one in their back garden. And so I think when we start collaborating with our neighbours and doing stuff at a bigger scale, that is where the big sustainable savings really start to come in. And that's when it starts making sense, not just in terms of sustainability, but in terms of being more economically viable. By collaborating, we actually share the burden and it helps. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think, solar panels... When I've talked to architects who do get more interest in that stuff than me, their view tends to be, well, solar panels aren't necessarily the best way of getting sustainable energy, but they're the most cost effective for the client because there's good payback on a solar panel, which you don't get for other things, which is a bit of a weird conversation to have. So people choose solar panels over other things because they're most cost effective rather than because they're best. Mm.
So is the next big step really trying to start the conversation in the community?
Yeah, I think so. And I think Bristol's awesome at that already, right? I mean, there's more grassroots stuff. I'm really excited at Bristol's Green Capital, and I think it really deserves it. I mean, there's loads of top-down stuff, which, don't get me wrong, that's good. But I also think there's loads of grassroots stuff, which is really unusual. There's communities who really want to do things and really want to make a difference. So I know guys who live in community houses, and I know there's movements of kind of taking old industrial buildings which are no longer used by industry and turning them into residential buildings because they appreciate that there's a need for residential buildings. And there are these movements which happen in Bristol which I've not come across anywhere else, where they say, do you know what, we could just make a difference, we could just get on and do it. We're not waiting for someone at the top to tell us to do it, we're just going to do it. And I love that. And I think if we could all be more like that, it would be really exciting.
Do you have a bit of a utopian vision for the future of cities and the future of buildings within, maybe let's say by 2050?
I'm probably massively naive in that I don't know what it will look like. I don't have a perfect map. I do encourage my students to think about what the buildings are like, the future of the city will look like, because actually we're designing buildings now which are going to stand up for 200 years, hopefully. So actually what we want our city to look like in 100 years' time is quite important, because we're putting bits of infrastructure and structures in that are going to still be there in 100 years' time. For me, I'd love to see cities which are using what they've already got, but much more effectively. So it really kills me when people knock buildings down to put another building in its place. I just think sometimes you can understand, so they knock down the courts, and I guess the courts are quite hard to change into like housing or something, because it's such a specific building, it has such a specific purpose. But to me, if there's a building there already, it's such a waste to knock it down to start again. It's, you can refurbish it, you can insulate it, you can put new super efficient plant in it, and you can make it incredibly environmentally friendly without having to waste all that energy that went into building the first one and then ripping it all out, creating a load of landfill and building a new one. So for me, a utopian city actually, it looks like Bristol looks now from the outside, but when you get inside, you have all these buildings which are massively energy efficient, and as well, it's not just about CO2, it's about communities working together. So I think for me, that was what's exciting about Lilac, that's what's starting to be exciting about Bristol, and actually that utopian city, I think, is not just about what it looks like in terms of visually, but actually what it looks like in terms of communities working together to solve real problems as well. Really exciting.
Do you want to lead on to our weekly questions then?
We have about 2 questions we like to ask every guest. And,
yeah, sure.
So first one is, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, what are you most excited for? And then on the flip side, what are you most worried about?
Wowzers. Wowzers. Do you know, I have no idea. That's really bad, isn't it? I have no idea. I think, what am I excited for and what am I most worried about? I think I'm excited about political change. I was talking with one of my colleagues just about politics, and actually as engineers we're not good at engaging with politics. We like to think we'll solve problems. But for me, I'm excited about kind of political change as well, because actually sustainability is deeply tied in with poverty. We can't solve the issues of sustainability without engaging in the issues of poverty and inequality. And I think the more we start, as engineers, we engage at a micro level in terms of, I'm going to design this building, I'm going to design this water treatment process, whatever it is. But we need to start saying, well, actually, there are these deep-seated problems which, as engineers, we really care about. But we also appreciate that we can't solve them on our own. We need to be engaging in kind of poverty reduction and kind of dealing with inequality across society and across our world. So I'm excited about that and terrified about that, because I think, that I can see us getting to a much better place in 40 years, and I can see us getting to a much worse place in 40 years. And I actually don't know where we're going to go. I feel it's on a knife edge. I think almost that's kind of my excitement and my fear kind of are all in one place, if that makes sense. Because I definitely don't have a clear vision of how we're going to get there. I kind of I can have these dreams, but I think, oh my goodness, how are we actually going to do that? How do we create this massive change that we really need to change? And I spend a lot of time thinking about my own life and thinking about, actually, I earn, compared to the average person in the world, massive amounts of money, and I spend most of it on myself. And if I'm not willing to make that change personally, how do I encourage other people to? And I kind of have these debates and struggles internally and think, blimey, this is tough. It's not easy. It's easy to talk about, but to do it is really hard.
Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time out to speak to us today. If you want to check out, we'll put the links for the comic book,
the record label,
the magazine that you mentioned earlier.
The works.
Absolutely everything.
Great. People can follow me on Twitter as well, at James Lecturer. I just try and make people think. Take lots of pictures of concrete if you like that kind of thing.
Of course.
But also lots of other pictures as well. And for me, at an engineering student level, I really get excited about getting engineers thinking about architecture, sustainability, so I try and throw all of that stuff up on there, and hopefully it encourages people to start their own journeys of discovery, you know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, real pleasure. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for all the support we've got so far, and of course listening to the episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you want to have a look at James' record label, which we talked about, Brian Records, or his son's comic book, we've included links to those in the show notes, along with his Best of Bristol lecture. You can also follow him on Twitter at James Lecturer, and of course you can also follow us at Bristol_real, and on Facebook we're just simply Bristol Real. If you just type in the search bar, you'll be able to find it easily. It's a good way to keep up to date with when the episodes come out, as well as getting some extra background info on each episode. We try and do one of those posts a week. That's about it. We've got a few guests booked at the moment, so expect some more great episodes coming soon. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.